I'm Patience Haggin. If you were here before, you heard me introduce myself before, but I'm an independent scholar and literary translator from Italian, and I'm from the US. This paper was born from research in Anna Maria Ortese's papers at the Archivio di Stato di Napoli in Naples, Italy. I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Dr. Rosanna Spadaccini at Archivio and Professor Eleonora Federici at University of Naples Orientale for making it possible for me to conduct research there. This is research in literary translator studies. I'm interested in questions of authorial and translatorial style. So this field is predicated on the belief that every author has a signature style. My work is concerned with looking at the translator's signature style as well as the author's. But of course, a translator's style will always be enmeshed with the author's. I believe that studying the translator's style as a translator will be core to the future of translation studies, and I intend for this paper to contribute to that growing body of research. My paper is also predicated on the belief that every individual's writing style is affected by a wide range of factors of which the individual may not be consciously aware. This is a belief that is supported by years of research from psychologists and linguists. The factors that affect style include gender, and that's the primary one I'll consider today. My paper will also draw on some of the most foundational concepts of translation theory. Primarily, I'm going to draw on a concept which I think needs no introduction, and that's Professor Lawrence Venuti's concept of domestication in literary translation. In Venuti's definition, domestication is the strategy of making a text closely conform to the culture of the target language. This may involve losing information from the source text. On the other hand, foreignization is the strategy of retaining information from the source text. It involves deliberately breaking the target language's convention to preserve this original text meaning. Now I'll share a few words about the author I'll be discussing. Anna Maria Ortese is one of the 20th century's most original voices. She was from Naples, Italy. She had little formal education and no university education. She writes in a very unusual style, sometimes described as feverish. She borrows some features from 19th century authors she admires, such as asides to the reader. And one quite unique characteristic is her narrators express very frequent uncertainty about their judgments and observations. And she often writes long, ornate sentences with multiple subordinate clauses. And her fiction often includes philosophical digressions. Her work has been translated by a list of people. In this paper, I'm focusing on two particular translators because I've been able to read Ortese's letters with those two translators. This lets me frame their translations in light of Ortese's relationships with the translators. In the case of both translators, Ortese ceded all her financial rights to the translation. She did this out of kind of philosophical disdain for money. Ortese struggled financially all her life, including at the time of these translations, yet she refused to accept compensation. And she treated translators and their art with a high degree of respect and trust. That's something that's going to come out as I discuss her correspondence with translators. So I'm going to be discussing two translations of Ortese's fiction by men, one into French and one into English. Decades of linguistic research have identified the qualities that differentiate women's writing from men's. Translation studies is beginning to study the ways that men and women translate differently. I kind of posit that one of the translators unknowingly made his translation sound more like men's writing. And this happened because he repressed a stylistic technique that is common in women's writing across languages. So first I'll discuss what that stylistic technique is. Researchers who compare men and women's writing have identified characteristics that hold true across languages. And it's a fascinating, never-ending area of research, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on just one characteristic. It's one that's especially noticeable and occurs very frequently in Ortese's fiction. And these are expressions called that linguists call hedges. These are qualifying terms and phrases that express uncertainty or hesitation. Some examples in English would be expressions like I think, in my opinion, maybe, or perhaps. Women use hedges a lot more than men in writing or speaking. That's true across languages. So that statement is certainly a generalization, but it is one that's been supported by countless studies. And I think it's fascinating to consider how much this results from perhaps innate differences or how much it results from cultural factors. But that's unfortunately beyond the scope of this paper. And what's more, as you probably noticed, this schema of men and women's writing only accounts for 2 genders. So it's by no means comprehensive, for considering the many experiences and expressions of gender, nor am I talking about the full effect of gender on writing style. But this blunt instrument is just going to be useful for my task at hand. My paper happens to consider only cisgender individuals. Since Ortese was a cis woman, the 2 translators I'll consider today were cis men. I'm also drawing on a concept from Dr. Vanessa Leonardi. She has studied differences in how men and women translate. So as Dr. Leonardi has written, when a man translates a woman author, there's a certain amount of mediation, which can have a significant effect on the text tone and style. In this paper, I borrow Leonardi's concept, and I'm going to consider the mediation that just comes naturally from the situational dynamics of a man translating a woman. The first translation I'll discuss is Le Chapeau à Plumes, which is a French translation of Ortese's novel Il Cappello Piumato, and the title means the feathered hat. This first-person novel is loosely autobiographical, inspired by Ortese's youth. The heroine is a young writer living in Milan during the 1950s. She falls in love with a journalist working for a communist newspaper and comes to believe that the Soviet regime has betrayed the communist dream. This novel's narrator is incessantly speculative and sometimes digresses into free association. She sometimes speaks to the reader in asides. And Claude Schmidt translated this novel into French. These are some letters between Ortese and the translator Claude Schmidt that were available in Ortese's archive in Naples. They reveal that Ortese had a very friendly relationship with Schmidt. He translated several of her works into French. In their correspondence, Ortese clarified the meaning of some expressions in the book for Schmidt, including a word of her own coinage. They also spoke on the phone, but their correspondence demonstrates a genuine friendship that went beyond professional courtesy. They signed their letters to each other with notes like affectionately, or with all my affection, or in friendship, or I'm thinking of you. Ortese could read French, so she was able to judge Schmidt's translations. In her letters, she profusely complimented Schmidt's translations of her work. She wrote that his translation of one of her short stories was a transparent, faithful translation that loses none of the original energy. I truly felt deeply emotional reading it. Ortese also relinquished to Schmidt all of her author's rights to the translation, including her financial rights. So she chose to receive no remuneration from the publication and sale. She also promised him that he was the only French translator she'd ever accept to translate her sprawling masterpiece, Il Porto di Toledo. After Ortese died in 1998, Schmidt wrote to her publisher and said he was Ortese's friend as well as her translator. He asked to know where she'd be buried so he could visit her grave. I realize PowerPoint isn't the best way to present a passage for someone to read. And I realize you may not read the languages on this slide, but I've placed here this passage in the Italian original and the French translation to make a point. And luckily you can immediately see what that is, even if you can't read a word of it. So what I'm trying to show is that Schmidt carefully preserved Ortese's hedges in his French translation. This sample passage serves as an anecdotal illustration, but in this paragraph, Schmidt has preserved all 5 of Ortese's hedges, which I've highlighted. And the expressions here in English would be, in a sense, I mean, that is, a bit, and it seems to me. The second translation I'm discussing is The Iguana, an American translation of Ortese's novel Iguana. In this novel, a wealthy count from Milan visits an uncharted island and falls in love with an iguana. So this book is a satirical magic fable dense with allusions to Shakespeare's Tempest. It's told by an omniscient narrator, like the kind created by 19th century novelists. The narration abruptly shifts between direct addresses to the reader and more conventional third-person commentary on the characters. And the narration also sometimes digresses into musings on nature and civilization. So the narrator's tone shifts very often from cynical irony to righteous outrage to cool philosophical speculation, so often all on the same page. Henry Martin, an American, translated this novel into English. In Correspondence, Ortese gave Martin explicit permission to make the English translation his own book and to take whatever liberties that required. She wrote, "Until now, no one, really no one, has spoken to me as deeply and seriously about Iguana as you do. I feel that you, Mr. Martin, have understood this story's enchanted and mythical spirit, have indeed looked it right in the eye, and you can translate this story without betraying the mad vision of the world hidden among its folds." Martin and Ortese shared enormous mutual respect for each other as artists, and their correspondence shows a professional collaboration. They signed their letters with terms like cordially or with great esteem. Martin offered to split the royalties equally with Ortese, but Ortese refused. Instead, she wanted virtually no rights at all for herself, in Martin's words. The final contract gave Ortese only 3% of royalties after the sale of the first 30,000 copies. Their letters acknowledge that Ortese knew perfectly well that selling that many copies would be virtually impossible. When the American publisher did still send Ortese $500, Ortese asked Martin to donate it to an organization that supported AIDS victims. In their ongoing correspondence during the months while Martin worked on the translation, Ortese assisted him with requests that you'd say were typical of the author-translator relationship, and similar to the way she worked with Schmitt on the French translation. She answered Martin's questions about suspected typographical errors. She explained difficult sentences to him, and she identified which Bible verses she'd quoted in a particular passage. But Ortese couldn't read a word of English, yet she was excited to receive the translation. She wrote to Martin that she was waiting for it the way children wait for Christmas presents. Martin's labor over the book became intensely personal, difficult, and inspiring for him. When Martin received the first copies, he wrote to Ortese, "Creating this book wasn't easy, but it's very nearly as if I didn't notice it. The book itself gave me strength, tenacity, maybe even the diplomatic spirit that I needed. It was an education like you don't often find." This is an excerpt from Ortese's Iguana and Martin's translation. In his translation, Martin omits many of Ortese's hedges all throughout the book. So I'm using this passage as an example. It's a sharply satirical passage. Of the 8 hedges in this passage, Martin preserves only 3. So by omitting many of Ortese's hedges, Martin imbues the narrator with more certainty than she had in the original Italian text. He also alters the syntax in many places, notably by beginning the first sentence of this passage with an authorial we. Using a we here makes the narrator sound a bit more certain, as though she's confident that others will share her judgment. I think an important thing to note here is the Iguana has an omniscient narrator, and this makes Ortese's use of hedges very unexpected and strange, right? Because it's pretty unexpected for an all-knowing narrator to also be uncertain about her judgments and observations. And perhaps this plays a role in why Martin suppressed the hedges as much as he did, because there's just a certain cognitive dissonance provoked by hearing an omniscient narrator who's all-knowing, but somehow still uncertain and hesitating. And in doing so, he ends up suppressing one of the most unique things about this text, and one of the most unique, the really unique narrator that she's created. By contrast, The Feathered Hat, which is the novel that Schmitt translated into French, has a first-person narrator. And that means Ortese's use of hedges, which was much less jarring when Schmitt translated it. Of course, it's much more logical, and natural for a first-person narrator to express uncertainty about her judgments and observations. So, and then I just want to share some words about how this translation was received. It came out when Ortese was 73 years old, and it was Ortese's first novel to be published in English. It was a critical success and won her international recognition for the first time. And reviewers of the English translation, who coincidentally included Lawrence Venuti, praised the translation itself for achieving kind of a pitch-perfect version of a difficult text, and for uniting in a unified voice the kind of the different tones throughout the book, like the sudden shifts from philosophical digression to satirical, to like satire. Like they praise them for like unifying that and doing it in a unified voice. Yeah. So now that I've discussed each translation and the relationship that each translator had with Ortese, I'd like to highlight the factors that I believe are important for understanding these translators' work. First, there's the nature of their relationship. So in both cases, the translator was in contact with Ortese to ask questions about the book's meaning and content. The crucial difference here is Schmidt's very warm friendship with Ortese. By contrast, Ortese's relationship with Martin was very professional and cordial, but it fell short of the warmth that Ortese had with Schmitt. Second, there's the explicit permission to take liberties. Ortese explicitly granted Martin this permission, but she and Schmitt didn't discuss it. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, does the translator really need the author's permission to take liberties? Which is a subject for another time. But whether you care if the translator seeks that permission or not, I'd say that having that instruction from the author would, of course, help a translator get over any hesitation they might have about taking liberties. Third, there's the author's ability to judge the work. Ortese was able to read Schmidt's French translation, and she praised him for it, but she couldn't read a word of Martin's English translation. I suggest that this may have a psychological effect on the translator. It may have encouraged Schmitt to produce a more literally faithful translation, and maybe that means to foreignize his text more. So a translator, as you can imagine, might do this to avoid questions from the author, or to avoid upsetting the author by seeming to change the text too much. By contrast, since Martin knew that Ortese wouldn't be able to read his translation, he was free of any concerns like that. And this might give a translator free range to domesticate all they want, since they'd be free of any anxiety over how the author might judge their translation. In conclusion, Martin suppressed Ortese's feminine stylistic quality of using linguistic hedges. This effectively masculinized Ortese's writing style in the Iguana and domesticated it for the audience of international literary critics. That audience was more used to men's writing. So this domestication may partially explain why Martin's translation was more critically and commercially successful than any of Ortese's prior publications. By making Ortese sound like a man, Ortese may have effectively made her work more appealing to the literary establishment. So my study is qualitative and barely skims the topic's surface. I believe this project would be well suited to a digital humanities analysis. With computational techniques, we could comprehensively analyze the extent to which these translations sound like men or women, and that computational study is going to be the next step in my research. This slide lists my key sources for scholarship. And thank you so much for letting me present. I'd love to hear any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I've absolutely enjoyed it because I tend to believe that women and men translate differently, and that has a very tangible impact on the translations themselves. So far, we have no questions, but I would like to know, are there any other known signs of female translation in a text? You mentioned the linguistic hedges, but perhaps there are other things you detected in your investigation.
Right. I think for this, I was focused on like ways that he seemed to give the narrator more certainty.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there are other factors at play here, which is, for one thing, women tend to use personal pronouns a lot more, and men tend to use articles a lot more. So there could be, you know, probably countless cases throughout the book where it says like, you know, her pen, and it becomes the pen in a man's translation. That would be a fascinating topic to study. I stayed away from it because I haven't put this through a digital humanities study yet, and I think that would be better suited to something that could be comprehensive and computational about it. For instance, just comparing the original text, how many personal pronouns there are, and then comparing the English translation, how many personal pronouns were used there. I mean, even that could be pretty enlightening, and I think could really open our eyes to that effect.
And I also found that when a feminist writer is translated by a man, feminism tends to disappear in Hungarian translation, at least in the period I studied. So not just linguistic science, but also the content and the ideas may become very, very different depending on the translator's gender. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. That's a really fascinating area.
I think it's absolutely fascinating because there are huge debates about who can translate who and whether it's acceptable. You may remember this controversial translation business sometime in the spring or summer about Amanda Gorman translations and who is allowed, and I think the Catalan translator was a white man who did the job pretty well, and then all of a sudden he was told that no, he shouldn't, and they should look for the Catalan publisher should look for a black woman to translate the poems, the whole book of poetry. So these happen actually in real life, that the gender of the translator becomes a very important factor. And there was also a huge debate about the same Amanda Gorman book in the Netherlands. So, and then all literary translators started to talk about this issue, that whether a man can translate a female work properly, and vice versa, of course. So, and it's very controversial, I think, even these days. People don't know how to relate to this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it would be fascinating to do a similar study with, you know, with writers of different racial backgrounds, see if there's a difference in style there. I think it's a totally fascinating topic, and there's probably like endless ways to kind of take a look at this issue.
I already decided to do something similar as soon as I have time, because we have lots of translations of Le Guin, an American poet and writer, but and I'm absolutely convinced that the men translators did a very, very different job. But yeah, it's a time-consuming job to go for this sort of research. Do you use corpus linguistics to compare the texts?
I haven't, well, I haven't begun to, no, I haven't begun to do so at all with these texts. And I was planning to use kind of our stylometry, the same as I used on the last project.
Mhm.
But I'm really open to suggestions.
Yeah, I was just curious. Fine. Questions? No, we have no questions. Are you going on doing stylometries and this kind of research concerning other Italian female writers?
A bit.
English translations or in French? Yeah.
A bit.
So-
I guess my focus is kind of translators. So my kind of, I'm interested in, as we talked before, like looking more at Anne Goldstein's work. I'm probably going to go by like translator by translator as I start to apply it. Yeah.
So you are going to have a huge database at the end.
Yeah.
Translations and comparisons. That sounds lovely. I'm looking forward to your publication. Definitely.
Yeah. That's encouraging.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was absolutely fascinating.